Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent I be considered under morning business for such time as I shall consume.
Without objection.
Mr. President, on Friday of well, first of all, Mr. President, I'm really here on the floor to express some concerns I have concerning Guantanamo Bay and the efforts that some people, for no reason that I can understand, want to close it. However, before doing that, another thing is happening right now. On Friday of last week, the administration set in motion a ticking time bomb with its release of an endangerment finding for carbon dioxide and 5 other greenhouse gases. The ruling proposes that carbon dioxide is a dangerous pollutant that threatens the public health and welfare and therefore must be regulated under the 1970 Clean Air Act. Now, this so-called endangerment finding sets the clock ticking on a vast array of regulations and taxes on small businesses throughout America that would just be devastating, and they claim, at least for now, to attempt to organize the chaos by limiting it to motor vehicles, which is a bad enough option considering the state of the auto industry, which we're also sensitive to today with what's happening. And any attempt to stretch the Clean Air Act to regulate these gases illustrates kind of a game of Russian roulette. We start with the auto industry, and I can assure you it's not going to end up there. They're presenting policymakers with a false choice, using an outdated, ill-equipped, economically disastrous option under the Clean Air Act, or to pick another bad option, cap and trade. What they're doing is saying we're either going to find this endangerment finding, which will allow us to go ahead under the Clean Air Act provisions of 1970, and we're going to then start something that would be almost the same thing as cap and trade, except it'll be done through the executive, and it'll be done through the Clean Air Act amendments, so that we will have no control on it as in terms of doing it through legislation. And as you know, there are several cap and trade schemes that are up there. Just last Friday, a week ago today, the Wall Street Journal, in an editorial, commented on this false choice, and they argue, and I agree with them. They said, and I'm quoting now from the Wall Street Journal a week ago today, it said, "Why would EPA confine the rule only to cars and trucks? By the EPA's own logic, it shouldn't matter where carbon emissions come from. Carbon from a car's tailpipe is the same as carbon from a coal-fired power plant. And transportation is responsible for only 28% of U.S. emissions versus 34% from electric generation. The EPA is clearly trying to limit the immediate economic impact of her ruling so as not to ignite too great of a business and consumer backlash. But their half measure is also too clever by half. By finding carbon a public danger, she is inviting lawsuits from environmental lobbies, demanding that EPA regulate all carbon sources. Massachusetts and 2 other states have already sued in federal court to force the EPA to create a NAAQS for CO2. And we've gone through the NAAQS process with particulate matter, and we know how that works. Now, for further background on this matter, let me explain. The history behind the EPA's proposed endangerment finding dates back to 1999. When the International Center for Technical Assistance, joined by Greenpeace, the Green Party of Rhode Island, Earth Day Network, and 15 other organizations, far left-wing organizations, I might add, filed a petition with the EPA demanding that it regulate greenhouse gas emissions from new motor vehicles. These groups urged the EPA administrator to reduce the effects of global warming by regulating the emissions on greenhouse gases for new motor vehicles. In the landmark Supreme Court case of Massachusetts versus EPA, they successfully argued that auto emissions were causing global warming, which in turn was eroding Massachusetts coastline. The remedy, they said, was to control greenhouse gas emissions from cars. All of this begs the obvious question: what effect would EPA regulation of tailpipe emissions actually have on global temperatures? In recent testimony before the House Ways and Means Committee on the climate impacts of regulating carbon emissions. Dr. John Christie of the University of Alabama, that's at Huntsville, found that such regulations would be, quote, an undoubtedly expensive proposition and would have virtually no climate impact. Christie calculated using the IPCC climate models. Now, let's keep in mind that's the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Climate Change, Panel on Climate Change, who have been very biased in this whole thing and who actually started this whole issue, the concept that man-made gases, anthropogenic gases, CO2, methane are causing climate change or global warming. So Christie calculated, using the IPCC climate models, that even if the entire country adopts these rules, the net impact would be at most 1/100th of 1 degree by the year 2100. Further, he said, even if the entire world did the same thing, the effect would be less than 4/100ths of a degree by 2100, an amount so tiny we can't even measure it. This is what Dr. John Christie has said. This, by the way, is almost exactly the same thing back when, during the Clinton administration, when we had Al Gore as vice president. He called upon someone to put together at that time that we were coming this close to ratifying the Kyoto Convention. He said, we want you to do a study and say that if we were to ratify the Kyoto Convention and all other countries that are developed nations would do the same thing, how much would it reduce the temperature in 50 years? And they did the study, and they found out it was 7/100ths of 1 degree Celsius. Now, they tried to hide that thing, but we did find it. So that's exactly the same thing that Dr. Christie is saying here that he has discovered and what he testified to just last week. Now, once the EPA makes a finding that greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare under the Clean Air Act, who specifically would be affected? As EPA's advance notice for a proposed rulemaking, that's taking place right now, they make it clear that an endangerment finding would lead to regulation covering nearly every facet of American economy. In reading through the comments filed in the regulatory docket, one is struck by how broadly the Clean Air Act would apply once an endangerment finding is made, especially previous sources that have never come under control of this act. The EPA received thousands of public comments from various industries and groups that expressed concern and outright opposition on issues of cost, competitiveness, jobs, administrative complexity to the greenhouse gas regulation under the Clean Air Act. The following excerpts were taken from comments filed by this proposed rulemaking, and they speak for themselves. This is the first one, Mr. President, is the American Association of Housing Services for the Aging. The members of this association, the American Association of the Housing Services for the Aging, help millions of individuals and their families every day through mission-driven, not-for-profit organizations dedicated to providing the services that people need when they need them in the place that they call home. Our 5,700 member organization, I'm quoting now from them, this is their testimony, 5,700 member organizations, many of which have served their communities for generations, offer a continuum of aging services, adult day services, home health, community services, senior housing, assisted living, and all of that. This organization opposes regulation of the greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. I'm quoting again. The Clean Air Act is not suited to regulate greenhouse gases. The EPA administrator and several other federal agencies have opined. In addition, if the EPA regulates greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, many of the AAHSA, that's the group, the Services for Aging, members could be subject to costly and burdensome Clean Air Act programs. For example, healthcare facilities with 51,000 square feet or greater would be subject to the Prevention of Significant Deterioration, that's a PSD it's called, permitting regulations. This would require such facilities to get a PSD permit prior to new construction or modifications. And finally, there is also the possibility that health care facilities would need to obtain Title V operating permits from the EPA 1 year from when the greenhouse gases become regulated, which would add to the already stressed budgets of nonprofit health care facilities. Now, that was the American Association for the Housing Services for the Aging. Here's another one. This is testimony just a week ago. The Family Diaries USA. Family Diaries USA is a diary cooperative of some 3,600 members located in the 6 state areas of the upper Midwest of the United States. Our members are involved in production agriculture, meaning that a majority of them produce the crops that feed the cows, that produce the milk, which feeds the nation. And we are opposed to the current regulations relating to greenhouse gas under the Clean Air Act as it relates to production agriculture. Now, this should be of interest to any of the members who are from ag states like my state of Oklahoma. I'm quoting now from this organization. Title V requires that any entity emitting more than 100 tons per year of regulated pollutant must obtain a permit in order to continue to operate. EPA has no choice but to require these permits once an endangerment finding is made. In other words, they have to do this. This is not something that's an option. The USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, has stated that an operation with more than 25 dairy cows emits more than 100 tons of carbon and would have to obtain permits under Title V in order to continue to operate if the greenhouse gases are regulated. Title V is administered by the states, and permit fees, taxes, varies from state to state. EPA sets a presumptive minimum rate for permits, and that rate is $43.75 per ton for 2008 and 2009. For states charging $43.75 per ton, the cow fee or the tax for dairy would be $175 a cow. The cow tax would impose a significant added cost for our dairy farmers that cannot easily be absorbed. Imposition of the tax would cause many operators to go out of business and would likely raise prices for their produce. Obviously it would. Now, all that was quoting from the American Dairies USA, the Family Dairies. Mark Magny, president of Magny Construction. We are a mid-sized construction firm. This is testimony last week. We employ 30 full-time staff and have been in business since 1994. We primarily engage in the construction of water and wastewater treatment facilities throughout the upper Midwest. We believe the Clean Air Act is ill-suited for regulating greenhouse gas emissions and that the EPA should not move forward with the proposed rule or other regulation of greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. Doing so, I'm quoting the small construction, doing so could easily delay, if not halt, all future building and highway construction. New construction and innovation and renovation are vital to our economy and to the future improvement of our environmental performance of our nation's infrastructure. It must not be allowed to continue. This is serious because right now we are looking at reauthorizing the transportation bill. The last time we did it was 2005. That was a $287.4 billion bill for a 5-year reauthorization. Now we're up for reauthorization in 2009, and we're right now trying to figure out what to do about America's infrastructure. All we don't need is have this additional regulation increasing the cost of the construction of the roads and bridges that are so desperately needed. According to Peter Glasser, a national legal expert on the Clean Air Act, an endangerment finding will lead to new EPA regulations covering virtually everything, including office buildings, apartment buildings, warehouse and storage buildings, educational buildings, health care buildings such as hospitals and assisted living facilities, hotels, restaurants, religious worship buildings, public assembly buildings, supermarkets, retail malls, agricultural facilities, and many others. An array of new development projects could be delayed perhaps for several years, causing an economic train wreck. This conclusion was supported recently by the Heritage Foundation's Center for Data Analysis, which found that EPA's new carbon regulations would destroy over 800,000 jobs and result in a cumulative GDP loss of some $7 trillion by 2029. The administration and other groups have recently argued that these are only scare tactics and that no one is taking EPA to do this, asking them to do it. They argue, in fact, that EPA has already figured out ways it could avoid sweeping in small sources of CO2. That's what they always say. Well, this is going to get just the big guys, not the little guys. I think we all know better. However, when Republicans on the EPW committee asked for the administration's nominee, who is set to head the office where the endangerment finding and regulations follow, it will be proposed how they plan to manage this. We haven't gotten a straight answer yet. And I know this, Mr. President, because I'm the ranking member on Environment and Public Works, and we're going through the nomination process and the confirmation process. I've been very cooperative. I certainly supported Lisa Jackson and others who, even though I don't agree with them philosophically, but we're not getting straight answers on this because nobody wants to get out on that limb. They don't want to admit that we're going to regulate everything if this comes along. One reason to question is not based on scare tactics. Staff covered some comments in the proposed record that argued quite differently. The Conservation Law Foundation, in their comment on EPA's advance notice of proposed rulemaking, that's what we're in the middle of now, on greenhouse gas regulation under the Clean Air Act, did ask EPA to regulate such sources. Moreover, both groups asserted that EPA is required by law, it's not optional, required by law, to apply the PSD program to sources emitting above 100 to 250 tons per year, and no exceptions, and that's pretty scary. The Center for Biological Diversity argued, quote, while it is uncontroversial, the EPA should prioritize the largest pollution sources first. One of the reasons that the NSR program will be such an effective tool for reducing greenhouse gas emissions is that it applies to a wide variety of sources that will emit in excess of an applicable statutory threshold of 250 or 100 tons per year. And that is a quote from this group. So that they are just admitting that that is the case. They argued that as a threshold matter, the asserted belief that EPA officials that the statutory requirements are burdensome or not efficient as they should be simply does not excuse the agency from following the law. The EPA has no authority to weaken the requirements of the statute simply because its political appointees don't like the law's requirements. But can't EPA just invent new thresholds? Several of the suggestions that the EPA has advanced are outside the scope of its authority. The EPA has no authority to set higher greenhouse gas major source cutoffs and at significant levels. This is something that is pretty scary, and I think that what we need to understand is that that we are looking at the United States of America. You know, I've been on this floor now for 9 years, starting way back when we were considering the ratification of the Kyoto Treaty. And I have to say, Mr. President, at that time I was the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee. Republicans were a majority and I was chairman. I assumed that man-made gases, anthropogenic gases, CO2, methane, were causing global warming because that's what everybody said. Until the Wharton School of Economics came out with the Wharton Econometric Survey. In this survey, they answered the question, what would it cost if we, in the United States, signed the Kyoto Treaty and lived by its emissions requirements? The range was between $300 and $330 billion a year. Now, after all these things that our new president's been doing with all the big spending and, you know, a $3.5 trillion budget and tripling the public debt in the next 10 years, we don't think too much about $300 billion being that much, but it really is. We're talking about $3,000 a family in my state of Oklahoma. Actually exceeds that. So I thought at that time, if there's some doubt as to the science, we better find out about it because we're signing this treaty and that's what it's going to cost people in America. Well, we started checking. We found out a lot. The whole thing started with the IPCC from the United Nations. They all wanted, they would love nothing more than to have some big global tax and not have to be accountable to individual countries. But maybe that wasn't their motive. I don't know. I do know this. We started looking at the science, only to find out that many of the people who were the leaders in other countries, names come to my mind like David Bellamy from the UK. He was with Al Gore 10 years ago marching up and down the street saying we're going to have to do something, global warming is going to kill everybody. And now he's one of the premier scientists in the UK. He's now actually in my side in terms of being skeptical as to the science. The same thing is true with Nir Shaviv in Israel, with Claude Allegra in France, the very well-known socialist, one that I don't agree with on anything except his new position, which is now refuted this idea that greenhouse gases are caused by man-made, or that global warming is caused by man-made gases. So with all these changes, and I suggest any of my colleagues here would like to see documentation. I have my website, inhofe.senate.gov. On this website, we cite all of some over 700 scientists that were on the other side of this issue that now have joined the skeptic list. Now, the reason they're trying to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act is because they know that they can't get it passed in this chamber. You know, and in the House, it probably would get passed. The White House has never had occasion to debate this issue. They haven't had it. We've had it 4 times. We had it in the Kyoto Treaty, we had it in the McCain-Lieberman bill, we had it in the Warner-Lieberman bill, and we had it in the Sanders-Boxer bill. And if you start and look at the trend, more and more of my colleagues are realizing now that the science isn't there, but the economics is there. If you look at what happened back in the 2005, I chaired the committee, so it was my responsibility to defeat this thing, and that was the McCain-Lieberman bill. And we had at that time, it was going to be about a $340 billion tax increase for the American people. And we debated it for 5 days, 10 hours a day. I stood right here at this desk for 50 hours. We could only get 2 or 3 senators to come down and participate and help me out on my side. But we defeated it, because people didn't want to have to go home and explain to people that on dubious science they're passing this huge tax increase. Then now you fast forward to 2008. In 2008, it was totally different, because that was the Warner-Lieberman bill. It was even a more aggressive bill in terms of its emission requirements. And the MIT had a value of that somewhere around $366 billion a year. So that would be another huge tax increase. Now, what happened in this 3-year period? In 2008, it didn't take 5 days to defeat it. It happened in 2 days. And 23 senators came down and helped me on the floor. Why are so many people concerned about, so many senators, so many House members, about getting into this issue? They'll vote right, but they won't. But they don't want to talk about it because they have huge amounts of money. MoveOn.org, George Soros, Michael Moore. They put in what I call the Hollywood elitists. They put in millions of dollars in here, and consequently, there are an awful lot of members that are afraid of the issue. But the bottom line is this. They only have 39 votes at most. They need 60 votes, and it's not going to pass. And since it's not going to pass the United States Senate, they're going to try to do as much as they can through regulation under the provisions of the Clean Air Act. Mr. President, just briefly, I want to share my findings. And I only wish that every member of the United States Senate would take the time to go down to Guantanamo